Charlotte's birthday party turned into a battlefield between two of the most powerful women in the House of Windsor. It started the moment Princess Anne looked across a crowded room and saw something on Queen Camilla that should never have left a locked vault. Heirloom that belonged to Queen Elizabeth, her mother. Camilla denied every single bit, and Anne went into detective mode. What she found after that night would tear open secrets the family had buried for years. The discovery. Princess Charlotte's 11th birthday was supposed to be one perfect night for the House of Windsor. Nobody inside that glittering hall at Buckingham Palace had any reason to expect the evening would end in fury instead. But Princess Anne was about to make sure it did. The hall looked perfect from every angle that night. Balloons floated near the ceiling, the cake stood tall and sweet, and King Charles watched his granddaughter with a proud smile on his face. Prince William and Princess Catherine stood close together, holding hands and soaking in the joy of the night. Everyone in that room was smiling, everyone except Anne. Anne always stood a little apart at these events, watching more than she spoke. That habit was about to pay off in the worst possible way. Her eyes drifted across the hall and landed on Camilla, and what she saw made her blood run cold and then boil all at once. Around Camilla's neck sat a massive sapphire necklace, matched perfectly with earrings and a bracelet, and Anne recognized that set the second her eyes locked on it. This was not just any jewelry. This was the exact set the late Queen Elizabeth had handed down specifically for Charlotte before she died. But why does that matter so much? Because Elizabeth had grabbed Anne's hand in her final days and made her swear an oath that these pieces must never be meant for personal glory. They belonged to the grandchildren, and especially to Charlotte. So why was Camilla parading around the room wearing them like a trophy she had earned? Anne did not wait around to think it through. She marched straight across the hall toward Camilla, with her jaw locked tight. A few guests near the dessert table caught the shift in her face and went silent fast. One young guest even lifted a phone to film what looked like it was about to explode into a scene, only for a palace aide to dive in front of the camera and yank the crowd's attention back toward the cake. Nobody outside that small circle ever knew how close this came to blowing up into a public scandal in front of half the guest list. Anne got right up close and kept her voice low and sharp. "That necklace looks very familiar," she said. "Isn't that the set my late mother left for little Charlotte?" Camilla spun around fast, with a tight smile slapped on her face, but her eyes flashed with panic for 1 second before she caught herself. "You are mistaken," she shot back. "This is my own design. I took inspiration from the old royal style, and people confuse it for the real thing all the time." But Anne was not buying a single word. "The sapphires sit in the exact same pattern," she snapped back. "Even the frame around every stone matches." Camilla let out a sharp laugh and waved her hand like the whole thing was beneath her, then spun on her heel and stormed off before Anne could push any further. Anne stood frozen in place, burning with fury that nobody else in that glittering hall could see what was staring them right in the face. Now here is where the story gets even darker. That sapphire set carries blood and grief behind every stone. Decades earlier, a foreign princess from a kingdom that no longer exists was forced to surrender this very set to the British crown as the price of a political deal she never had the power to refuse. Less than a year later, she took her own life. To this day, a handful of older palace staff still whisper its real name behind closed doors. They call it the widow's stones. Elizabeth knew the brutal history soaked into that jewelry, and that is exactly why she banned anyone from wearing it outside her own bloodline. Handing it to Charlotte was not some sweet grandmotherly gesture. It was Charlotte trying to finally bury a curse in safe hands. Someone else in that hall understood exactly what that necklace meant the second she caught sight of it. An elderly woman, a former lady-in-waiting who had packed away Elizabeth's jewelry with her own hands after her death, was standing only feet from Camilla when she spotted the sapphires. Her face turned white as a sheet, and she grabbed the table beside her just to stay on her feet, because she was not looking at some clever copy. She was staring straight at the exact piece she had sealed into storage herself. An aide rushed her into a side room before anyone could ask a single question, but Anne caught her terrified face from across the hall and locked it away in her memory, with no idea yet how much that one moment would matter. That night, sleep never had a chance. Anne sat alone scrolling through old photos until her eyes burned, and every new photo dragged her deeper into fury. There was the emerald necklace Camilla wore at a diplomatic ceremony months before. There were the sapphire earrings from an official state visit. There was the diamond brooch Elizabeth used to wear at family anniversaries, somehow sitting around Camilla's neck in a recent photo. Every single piece matched something stolen straight out of the late Queen's private collection, down to the smallest cut of every stone. The next morning, Anne picked up the phone and called the vault manager, a man named Holloway, demanding answers. What he told her ripped the floor out from under her. He admitted that weeks earlier, several jewelry boxes had been dragged out of the vault under so-called special orders, with paperwork missing proper signatures. Holloway claimed he was only following commands from someone above him and never dared to ask questions. Furious, Anne demanded an emergency inventory on the spot, and when it came back, every single piece sat exactly where it should be. Nothing was missing. Every seal was sealed tight. But how can that even be possible? Anne had photos showing that exact jewelry sitting on Camilla's body in public, yet the vault swore nothing had ever left its place. Something was rotten here, and Anne felt it burning in her gut, even without solid proof in her hands yet. She stood in front of those locked glass cases for a long time, staring at jewelry the records claimed had never been touched, while her own eyes screamed a completely different story at her. That gap between what Anne had witnessed and what the paperwork swore was true lit a fire under her that refused to die out. It planted one dangerous question deep in her mind, and that question was about to drag her straight into the most guarded and secretive corners of the palace, places she never imagined she would ever need to break into. The cover-up. Anne moved fast but careful, knowing one wrong step could tip off the very people she was hunting. She demanded 2 full years of vault records, every inventory report, every handover receipt, every seal log she could grab. The irregularities jumped out almost instantly. Seals had been replaced without a single explanation. Fresh glue sat on boxes that were supposedly never touched. Sharp little scratches scarred metal cases that should have stayed locked away for months untouched. Timestamps on certain entries simply refused to match the official schedule, and the deeper Anne dug, the more those broken dates clustered right around Camilla's biggest public moments. Every page she turned felt like another nail driven into a coffin somebody was desperately trying to keep shut. To crack this case wide open, Anne needed someone willing to talk, and that someone turned out to be a retired vault worker named Whitfield. She met him far from palace grounds, somewhere quiet enough for him to finally let his guard down. Even then, fear cracked through his every word as he described what he had witnessed with his own eyes. He claimed that some boxes were dragged out late at night, right before Camilla's biggest public events. Then the same boxes were rushed back within hours, sometimes the very same day, with clear orders barked down to stay completely silent, no matter what. Whitfield spoke carefully about Camilla's brutal early years marrying into the family, how the public constantly slammed her against the memory of Diana and never let her breathe, how every public appearance felt like walking into a trial she was destined to lose. He believed deep down that wearing those stolen pieces had become Camilla's twisted way of finally proving she belonged at the center of the family instead of standing buried in someone else's shadow. It was no excuse, but it handed Anne a clearer picture of the storm she was walking into. Then Whitfield hesitated, and what spilled out next was something he swore he had never told a single living soul. Years earlier, not long after Camilla first married into the family, he had witnessed an almost identical late-night removal, except that time it involved something smaller and far more personal, a piece tied directly to Diana's own memorabilia. Back then, he assumed it had been properly authorized, so he kept his mouth shut. Looking back now, knowing everything he knows today, Whitfield believes it might have been the very first test, the moment Camilla first found out exactly how far she could push the system without anyone noticing. This was never one moment of weakness. This had been simmering and building for years. That single confession changed everything in Anne's mind. If this pattern truly ran that deep, then Holloway could not be acting alone, and Anne was right to suspect him from the start. His willingness to bend the rules was never a simple fear of losing his job. Years earlier, He had quietly crawled out of a brutal financial disaster thanks to a discreet payment traced straight back to Camilla's office, dressed up at the time as a routine staff welfare gesture. Nobody questioned it then because it looked harmless on paper, but in truth, that payment had bought his silence on something smaller that nobody ever bothered to dig into. So if Camilla called him now demanding loyalty, she was not asking for a first favor. She was collecting on an old debt she had engineered years in advance, fully aware that a man with that much to lose would never dare cross her. Holloway had been hers from the very beginning. He just never knew it would end up costing him this much. While Anne kept pulling these threads tighter, word reached Camilla that the investigation had not slowed down for even a second. Panic hit her fast, but she did not waste a moment feeling sorry for herself. She slammed straight into damage control mode. She called Holloway and made it brutally clear that his story needed to stay locked in place. No changes, no slip-ups, with a generous reward waiting for his continued loyalty. That same afternoon, the payment quietly went through. She did not stop there. Important handover documents started vanishing from the official files. Other pages mysteriously had their dates, times, and signatures altered just enough to muddy every trail Anne had been following. To make matters worse for Camilla, every witness Anne had once spoken to freely suddenly turned ice cold overnight. People who had answered her questions without hesitation now claimed they could not remember a thing clearly, or said they had been away on leave during the exact weeks in question. One former vault worker even slammed the phone down the second he heard Anne's voice, too terrified to say another word. But here is the thing about panic. It never hides as well as people think it does. Every sudden silence, every shaky excuse, every conveniently vanished document only confirmed what Anne already knew deep in her bones. She told her closest aide flat out that fear like this does not happen over nothing, and that the panic itself was practically a confession. By now, Anne had testimony, a trail of altered records, and a pattern stretching back years. Yet she still lacked the one thing she needed most, a confession straight from Camilla's own mouth. Indirect evidence could always be explained away or denied outright, and Anne knew that better than anyone in that palace. There was only one path left open to her. She would have to face Camilla herself, with no aides nearby and no witnesses to soften the blow about to land. The reckoning. Anne picked the location herself, a quiet sitting room at Balmoral on a gray and drizzly afternoon. There were no aides and no witnesses, just the two of them, finally face to face, with weeks of buried fury sitting between them like a loaded weapon. Anne skipped the small talk entirely and told Camilla straight to her face that she knew about the jewelry boxes dragged out at night, the replicas, and the seals quietly swapped before every major event. Did Camilla really believe she could bury something this big forever, especially from the one daughter Elizabeth had personally trusted to guard everything she left behind? Camilla dug in hard. "I am the Queen," she snapped. "I do not need to stoop to anything this low, and you are slandering my name for nothing." Anne did not flinch for a second. She laid out the evidence piece by piece, calm but razor sharp. The payment to Holloway, the clumsily altered records, and the fact that whoever gave those orders had to know the exact moment the seals were swapped before each of Camilla's biggest public moments. How else could anyone explain that many coincidences lining up so perfectly? That question finally cracked Camilla wide open. Her temper exploded, and her voice tore through the room as she shouted that she had every right to use the jewelry, that she only borrowed it for a short time to help the royal image, and that it belonged to the family anyway, so no real harm was done. Then came the words that buried her completely. "You just admitted you only borrowed them for a short time," Anne said, dead calm. Only the person giving the orders would know that detail. Camilla's face drained white as she realized exactly what had just flown out of her own mouth. What she did not know was that Anne had been recording every single word since the moment she walked into that room. This was the moment the whole rotten scheme finally ripped into the open. Camilla had spent months secretly working with a small ring of master jewelers scattered across the continent, men and women bound by brutal non-disclosure contracts and paid staggering sums to keep their mouths shut forever. Using old palace photographs and exact measurements smuggled out under false pretenses, the jewelers built copies so flawless that even trained gemologists would struggle to tell them apart from the originals. Every time a major state event approached, palace staff working for Camilla slipped into the vault under the cover of routine maintenance and lifted the real jewels out. Then a replica went in to take their place on the velvet, sitting in the exact spot where the original had rested, so that anyone glancing inside would see nothing out of order. Meanwhile, the real jewels traveled out into the open, draped on Camilla herself, who paraded them in front of cameras and crowds who had no idea they were looking at pieces that technically were not supposed to have left the building. Once the event ended, the process ran in reverse. Staff pulled the replica out of the vault and slid the real jewels back into their place, restoring everything before any scheduled inventory could catch a gap. For as long as the rotation held, the vault was never empty, and the records never showed a discrepancy. Something was always there. It just was not always the truth. With the recording locked safely in her hands, Anne marched straight to King Charles, and an emergency family meeting exploded into motion at Balmoral. Charles sat at the head of the table, with disappointment carved into every line of his face. William gripped Catherine's hand tight beside him, with fury burning behind his eyes. Camilla sat across from them, fighting to hold herself together even as her composure cracked wide open. Anne stood and played the recording for the entire room to hear. Camilla's own voice ripped through the silence, confessing in her own words exactly what she had done. Whitfield's testimony followed next, along with the altered seal records and a brutal timeline tying every single removal straight to Camilla's public appearances. This was never simple theft, Anne said sharply. This was a calculated, repeated scheme, hidden behind replicas good enough to fool nearly anyone alive. Camilla tried weakly to defend herself, insisting she only ever wanted to finally be seen and accepted, and that none of it had truly hurt anyone. But against a recorded confession, a shaken witness, and a stack of doctored paperwork, she had absolutely nothing left to hide behind. She dropped her head and finally admitted the truth out loud, that she had abused her position to raid the collection without ever following proper procedure, and that she had been dead wrong to do it. Buried inside the documents Anne slammed onto that table was one more discovery that made the whole picture even darker. Not long after Elizabeth's death, Camilla's office had quietly filed paperwork attempting to have several pieces, including this very sapphire set, reclassified from crown property held in trust into her own personal possession outright. The request had been rejected and buried at the time, but its existence proved something far uglier. This had never simply been about borrowing jewelry whenever she pleased. It had been the early groundwork of a calculated plan to legally seize ownership of pieces that were never meant to leave the family's protected collection. In the days that followed, far from the cameras and the official statements, William demanded a private moment alone with his father. His tone stayed calm but left zero room for negotiation. He told Charles flatly that the moment the crown passed to him, Camilla would never again be allowed near the working jewel, and she would never again be presented as queen at any official state function during his reign. Charles, worn down and clearly ashamed, offered no argument in return. That quiet ultimatum never reached the public, but it guaranteed the consequences of this scandal would follow Camilla for the rest of her life, long after the headlines finally burned out. New rules slammed into place almost overnight. Around the clock, surveillance cameras now watch over the vault like hawks. Every special order requires signatures from at least 2 senior family members before anything can move an inch. Just days later, news of the entire scandal leaked to the public anyway, and headlines exploded across every major outlet, tearing into Camilla for abusing Elizabeth's legacy for her own personal gain. Her public image took a brutal hit, and not long after she quietly vanished from her usual royal duties, with no real explanation offered to a public hungry for answers. Anne stood alone on the balcony at Balmoral a few days later, with the cold wind cutting past her as she stared out over the hill. "Mother, Elle did it," she whispered to herself. It did not feel like a clean victory. It rarely does in moments like this, when protecting one promise costs the family something it can never fully buy back. The legacy was finally safe, but the trust that once held this family together would take far longer to rebuild, if it ever could be rebuilt at all.